State University. His scholarship explores the history of conservatism, capitalism, popular media, and African American history. His forthcoming book, Winter in America, A Cultural History of Neoliberalism from the 60s to the Reagan Revolution, is out this year. I hope we'll learn more about that. As a starting point for bipartisan engagement, Dr. McClure believes that Kansas progressives, Democrats, and Republicans must invest party resources in outreach addressing concrete needs. They must invest in the needs of the 95%, not the 1%. We need to find ways to support local communities, small business, farmers, and improvements with infrastructure. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in chat and we'll stop periodically to take them. And if you don't want me to see eating chips, turn off your video. And Dr. McClure, here you go.
All right, let's see here. All right, well, I'd like to thank Deb Ludwig and Trina Powell and the Ellis County Democrats for inviting me to talk today. I would also like to thank CJ Genovi, who's the one of the editors at the Kansas Reflector. And I would say over a period of about 3 months, she taught me how to write an op-ed. I'm still stuck in sort of academic speak, and CJ really helped me to kind of crush down arguments into 750 words. So today's talk is going to work through the roots of our contemporary political polarization, which includes the always festering pull of mob violence. We shouldn't be surprised at mob violence. I mean, this is, if you've never read D.H. Lawrence's Studies in Classic American Literature, highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite all-time books. You can always find a cheap copy. But the way that D.H. Lawrence, who came to the United States, I think in the teens, he lived in Taos for a while, and then he wanted to write a defense of American literature because the English were so, they basically said the Americans can't create anything. But in his sort of attempt to defend American literature, some of the articulations of American identity just are timeless, in the sense of, he says things that you read and it sounds contemporary. At the same time, it's something that sounds perfect for 1800. And so he's just, it's kind of like James Baldwin. I always put him in that category of kind of being able to articulate timeless elements that things might change over time, but the main components are sort of, they're always sort of, they're there in that sense. My own research traces the relationships between culture and economics. I like to look at how economics, what's the culture of economics and what's the economics of culture. And I'm interested in the ways Americans participate in violence, both physically and rhetorically, usually towards marginalized groups, but at the same time framing this antagonism as patriotic or righteous. And I focus on the culture of information flows. Today, in terms of like Facebook would be an information flow, Parler would be an information flow, but also popular media being information flows. McClure magazine from 100 years ago is a part of sort of this culture. So I'm interested in the way that language and knowledge is distributed, and how people react to it and engage with that. But at the same time, I'm also interested in memories of the past and how we construct memories to help justify the present, using this language and knowledge of information flows. So before going into this, I always, these are awkward because it's not in person and we're stuck looking at a screen, but I've kind of gotten into the habit of summarizing everything before we go through in depth. So I see today's events as an extension of the decline of trust in government after the 1960s. Right? The 60s, 70s is the critical click, right? It's the epochal shift in American history, right? A part of this shift stems from the debates over the Vietnam War, Watergate, the fears of ever-growing big business, big government, and big labor, right? As well as the reaction to the social equality legislation from the 1960s. And what happened with that this civil rights movement, I call it social equality legislation. What that did was it undermined the monopoly of white male power in the US. And this reaction to this undermining is what we would call the conservative culture war of today, right? It's evolved, but it has its roots in this moment in the 60s. With the shift to the right and the rise of Reagan and the new economic system called neoliberalism in the late 1970s and 80s, the standard of living for working and middle class people declined significantly. Wealth inequality since then has exploded, and the result has unsurprisingly provoked a populist response. In Kansas, we should remember this thing called populism, right? Just as wealth inequality hit during the rise of monopolies and big business in the 1880s and 1890s in Kansas, the 1980s and 1990s also saw this populist response, right? Except this populism was different from the small farmer-led economic populism of the late 19th century, the ones you learn about in Kansas history. Because the late 19th century populists criticized the capital concentration. They criticized big business, and they criticized monopoly influence over state and federal government. The post-1970s populist response is socially and culturally conservative in nature, and it does not focus on economics, but rather on culture. The outcome, however, has insulated the economic system of neoliberalism, or we could also call this Reaganomics, right? It insulates it from the type of criticism populists a century ago engaged in, right? In short, the current manifestation of populism does not critique wealth concentration. As the US became more multicultural in the wake of the 1960 social equality legislation, these gains were blamed on the declining standard of living for white working and middle classes, right? Ask someone what decade they believe making America great again refers to, and most likely they'll point to the 1950s, right? A decade that was the last gasp of legislated white male supremacy, but also paradoxically a decade defined by economic policies which redistributed wealth downward toward the white working and middle classes. In short, the white working and middle class people went from an economic populism defining most of the 20th century towards a populist conservatism after the 1960s. Driven by the conservative culture war, populist conservatism has escalated amidst wealth inequality and a multicultural America, including vast conspiracies supported by the ex-president of the United States. Armed with this flow of information, good people are driven to do acts counter to the very founders' ideals they claim to hold dear, including an attempted coup, push, riot, or whatever we want to call January 6th, 2021. While these acts might be perceived as the antithesis to civic virtues crucial for patriotism, for the participants, they were righteously aggressive enactments of civic virtue. In their minds, storming the Capitol reflected their patriotism. The emotion of this era is not new, however. It is a performance of earlier moments in history. So it's always the question of how we got here. And so we'll just kind of look at this picture. It's one of my favorite images to use to give students an idea of that late 19th century idealization of the American past in the present. So in this sense, it's the 1870s. So in the 1600s, Englishmen and women fled the old world and arrived in the so-called New World, right? In order to create a new homeland already occupied by indigenous peoples, Englishmen and women needed to imagine themselves as settlers and not invaders. Violence soon characterized the relationship between the indigenous and the English, as more land was needed and cultural differences could not be bridged. For indigenous peoples, the settlers became invaders and the beginning of their own apocalypse. Aided by disease, often deemed the work of God, violence and subjugation helped construct an idea of difference defined by Europeans. These ideas turned into policies of further expropriation of land through more violence. This expansion, and this is the critical part, this expansion became the essence of liberty and freedom, right? As well as the mythological foundation of the American spirit heading west as depicted by John Gast. Along with expansion came the enslavement of Africans, forcibly brought to the North American colonies to live and work in what is essentially a racial dictatorship. Their coerced labor produced wealth for the colonies and the young republic. Emerging class differences were dampened by these new ideas of difference that we now call race, right? This idea of race. With enemies such as as Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and African Americans, the white poor, workers, and white farmhands identified more with the whiteness of the colonial elite than those they learned to hate. This really great quote from President Lyndon Johnson, where he once said, quote, "If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, if you give him somebody to look down on, he'll empty his pockets for you," end quote. Most importantly, they saw their futures as landowners. They just needed to keep going west to gain land in the name of liberty, freedom, and progress. The success of this system reinforced the belief that God was on their side. So American identity emerged through this matrix of violence, religion, and an ever-evolving idea of racial difference, resulting from settler colonialism and slavery. To be free was to be white, while Blackness conjoined with the social death of enslavement. To be in a free homeland also meant to remove any trace of Native Americans who might question this God-given manifest destiny. Colorblind cultural terms justified these policies as civic virtues, right? It was merely a struggle of civilization versus savagery. Also note the only woman depicted in this picture that is of European descent, right? Because in this state of emergency in creating a homeland, masculinity demanded the submission of femininity as the restriction of women's freedom found root in the name of protecting a national domestic freedom. Pious women or ladies did not need rights if men protected them. Thus, American culture also included rules on sexuality, family hierarchy, and an evolving white masculine civic virtue normalized into something we now call tradition. The hierarchies of race, gender, and sexuality gained adherence with an increasingly nationalistic fervor leading from the Revolutionary era up through the 1800s. To be an American at the dawn of the 19th century meant to be white and male. The new republic even wove these white nationalist rights into the fabric of the nation. The 3/5 Compromise of 1787 recognized the enslaved as not fully human. The Naturalization Act of 1790 declared only white people could be citizens. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared Black people were not citizens and had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896 legalized the slavery era law and made Jim Crow segregation a critical part of civic virtue and responsible government across the 20th century. Various court cases removed citizenship from Chinese and Japanese Americans, including the rights to own land. And it was only in 1920 that white women gained the constitutional right to vote. Right? So by the dawn of the 20th century, these civic virtues were thoroughly normalized as a masculine white nationalist system of government and culture under the banner of liberty and freedom. Right? We have to, this is the tough part is trying to reconcile sort of atrocities with sort of all men are created equal. And that's really what race and gender did to reconcile that conflict. Race allows Americans to talk about liberty and freedom at the same time have a system of segregation and those types of things that are built on oppression in a country founded on liberty and freedom. Without race, you can't really do that. So that's why race continues to be a factor in American life. It's a part of the heritage, but it's also woven into the fabric sort of this tradition, right, of this nation. And when this civic virtue was challenged, the righteous mob would arrive in force to protect their liberty and freedom. An echo of today, we can look back on Wilmington, North Carolina, and the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. At this time, white nationalist Southern Democrats, backed by banking, railroads, and big business, remember this is the time of populism, overthrew the white populist and African-American fusion party. So basically, a small farmer populist formed an alliance with basically like a black middle class, and they created this fusion party, and the Southern Democrats, the former Confederates, went to overthrow it. There was an actual coup involved, one of the only coups in US history. Following the coup, whites massacred African Americans in the name of liberty and civic virtue. And you can see a burning place there. And below are the red shirts. So they're like the Klan, but there's that area's sort of paramilitary arm of Southern segregationist Democrats. By the early 20th century, ideas of race had the backing of science, right? So, and we call that eugenics. Even the Nazis came to the US in the 1930s to learn about eugenics and how the United States engaged in racial segregation, right? To be white meant to have the right to do violence against people of color if you deem them a threat to communities, or the trespass upon tradition or civic virtues. Liberty and freedom included mob murder and the right to not be arrested for the murder of someone of color, despite the documented evidence. And the picture at the top there, I took the bodies out because too often we have to always look at the bodies of the victims, but I'm always more interested in sort of the happy, excited faces upon the folks that are engaged in the murder of people. And lynchings were often photographed and sent around as postcards at the time. So, and it was even a time of romance. As you can see, they're holding hands. And these are the two bodies that are hanging in the background. The ritual of lynching at its height between the 1880s and 1930s created moments of white nationalist solidarity sealed through public black torture and death, including selling pieces of the body to onlookers, including toes, fingers, penises, even a head, which might be prominently placed in the storefront of a shop, of a local shop. As seen in the 1896 Wilmington Massacre, white resentment also included rage against Black economic success, with the Tulsa Massacre in 1921 representing the most spectacular display of white nationalist frustration toward Black success. And those are the photos at the bottom when whites in Tulsa invaded what was called Black Wall Street, one of the wealthiest Black communities in the United States, and they proceeded to burn the whole place down and massacred up to 200-300 people. Race permeated all of culture, whether one was a Republican or a Democrat. Hollywood films were explicitly racist, as were middle-class magazines and their advertisements. White supremacy formed the very root of civic virtue, of traditional values, and according to science, natural hierarchies. Again, eugenics basically instilled in people through today, when people say that there are these biological differences between white and Black, and you also see this in sort of when people get anxious about interracial marriages, right? It's based off this era of eugenics. So all this stuff still haunts us despite us not, talking about eugenics. While the horrors of Nazi Germany put a damper on overt expressions of white supremacy after World War II, the sentiment and culture constructed across 300 years would survive as the language describing inequality, right, shifted in time. And so once we get into the post-war years, there's a revamping of conservatism that's somewhat different. It's similar to that 1920s conservatism, but 1950s, you have a reassessment of what conservatives are. And so I always like to go back to kind of simple definitions, and I've just pulled these off of different locations, right? Conservatism is a political social philosophy promoting traditional social institutions in the context of culture and civilization, right? The central tenets of conservatism encompass traditional values or practices, right, in the context of the culture and civilization in which it appears. A commitment to traditional values and ideas with opposition to change or innovation, right? Or the holding of political views that favor free enterprise, private ownership, and socially traditional ideas. Right? So, and then the other thing I like to do is I like to go straight to sort of the authors that helped define modern day conservatism. And so one of these intellectuals is Russell Kirk, who was sort of a giant at the time of conservatism kind of theorizing. And in his program for conservatives, written in 1954, the same year as Brown v. Board, he writes that some men are richer than others, and that some have leisure more than others, and that some travel more than others, and that some inherit more than others, and that some are educated more than others, is no more unjust in the great scheme of things than that some undeniably are handsomer or stronger or quicker or healthier than others. And I like to note that there's always a lean towards creating, these are ideas of natural hierarchies, right? Being stronger, quicker, handsomer, or healthier, right? And then comparing that to sort of that above list. He continues, this complex variety is the breath of life to society, not the triumph of injustice. Poverty, even absolute poverty, is not an evil. It is not evil to be a beggar. It is not evil to be ignorant. It is not evil to be stupid. All of these things are either indifferent or else are occasions for positive virtue, if accepted with a contrite heart, right? And here's sort of probably the key part of this definition. What really matters is that we should accept the station to which a divine tactic has appointed us with humility and a sense of consecration. And we can translate this, right? That's done with Russell Kirk. We can translate this as both a reaction as a conservative to the redistributionist policies of the New Deal welfare state that kind of defines the post-war world, but also the social world in which Kirk existed, right? As someone born in 1918, the world of racial science and Jim Crow was natural to an intellectual such as Kirk, including the notion that men were superior over women, right? This was the divine tactic, right? Any struggle against this would be against tradition, would be against social order, it would be against civilization. Another founding father of modern day conservatism is William F. Buckley. Probably more familiar with him. He had that television show. Great show. Like I have like too many episodes on DVD that I watch. But in 1957, in an issue of in the National Review, he defended Southern segregationists. And he wrote, reasonable limitations upon the vote are not exclusively the recommendations of tyrants or oligarchists. Was Jefferson either? The problem in the South is not how to get the vote for the Negro, but how to equip the Negro and a great many whites to cast an enlightened and responsible vote. The South confronts one grave moral challenge. It must not exploit the fact of Negro backwardsness to preserve the Negro as a servile class. It is tempting and convenient to block the progress of a minority whose services as menials are economically useful, so long as the South is merely asserting the right to impose superior mores for whatever period it takes to effect a genuine cultural equality between the races. And so long as it does so by humane and charitable means, the South is in step with civilization as is the Congress that permits it to function. Again, these are key expressions because they have moved away from the overt language of white supremacy that characterized someone like Teddy Roosevelt, right, up till about the 30s. Like the middle class America had no problems with saying racist terms in the public sphere and magazines, but the Nazis sort of ruined it. And so after World War II, everything kind of becomes coded. You use civilization as sort of whiteness, and you don't say white out loud. And you use this term culture, right? Instead of biology or science, you shift over to use the term culture. But the ideas behind this are still the same that they've inherited through this point. Now, in terms of conservatism, what are they struggling against in the larger picture? Well, the larger picture is the New Deal welfare state, right? So anyone who was alive during the 1950s and 60s experienced the New Deal welfare state. Driving here from Southern California, and we came up south through Oklahoma, and then we took those highways cutting through Kansas, and then we came up what Vine Street as it goes south. And you go through all these small towns and you see all these closed storefronts. Well, those storefronts were most likely put in place during this time when there was enough circulation of capital or money that created a demand to create storefronts and fill them with shops. In today's economy, those shops are now, they're either closed up and people have moved away because there's no point in living in a place that doesn't have a circulation of capital. We see this in Hayes as well, right? You can almost do an archaeological, assessment of when buildings were made and anticipate what kind of demand made the construction of those buildings, a priority. Anyway, the New Deal welfare state, right, emerged from the Great Depression in the 1930s and World War II and created a strong, growing white working and middle class across the 1950s and 60s, including a wider distribution of income and wealth called the Great Compression, right? And you can see in terms of the dates here, the Great Compression lasts, give or take, between the beginning of World War II up through about the late 70s. The demand side of Keynesian-inspired welfare state involved a social democratic framework. So think of Bernie Sanders, and he's scary, right? But in many ways, the policies of Bernie Sanders point back to this Great Compression. He's really not radical if we put him back in 1955, except for his views on race, which he was actively involved in the civil rights movement. But the welfare state was a social democratic framework where the federal government took control of economic priorities in the wake of the Great Depression and World War II. Through a tentative partnership between government, business, and labor, the welfare state molded an economy based on the redistribution of income downward to create a strong consumer economy. Rather than today's supply side logic, this demand side economics pushed income into the hands of regular folks who would channel the money back through private enterprise. Right? And that's sort of the American version of social democracy, was always a form of capitalism. It just had a different configuration to it. So what did the welfare state look like? Because this always sounds great, right? Like, oh, look at the redistribution of wealth, of income, and regular folks are doing well. Well, there's sort of the Faustian bargain with this. The welfare state was both utopia and a racial dictatorship, depending on one's race, right? Because white nationalism still dominated American culture and economic circuits, the distribution of income primarily went towards white men and their families, including federally mandated redlining of non-white neighborhoods blocked from receiving federal subsidies. And on that lower right is an old map of how redlining works. So the green areas were the whitest, and the red areas, basically all people of color. And then the color gradations sort of go from a mixed neighborhood to mostly white to green, all white. And this led to an all-white suburbs, right, including the perceived suburban utopia founded on the image of white male supremacy. And those are the images that you see here in these old advertisements, right, of sort of the, you know, the man in the suit. And it's just sort of this utopic view. We also see this in those 1950s shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. In suburban America, civic virtue imagined white men as naturally occupying positions of power without competition from people of color or women. Right? I guess the show's old now. Mad Men kind of gives a view of this, right? That shift. These policies helped further reinforce that this was a natural hierarchy, right? So for many people, this is the natural state of being, right? This is the way that things should be, even though it was completely constructed through, you know, centuries of legacies, but also this post-war welfare state that helped create this. This is also the era that is the emotional root of making America great again. Right? So again, the irony of making America great again is it wants this simplicity. It wants this life that middle-class, working-class white people enjoyed in terms of standards of living. But it doesn't acknowledge that this could only be created through a welfare state. And that's that paradox, right? That's the paradox. In the 1960s, however, the social world of race and gender relations was destabilized, right? Upsetting centuries of old hierarchies. In the face of these challenges came the inevitable reaction, the conservative culture war anticipated by Kirk and Buckley, right? Which called on a renewal of tradition to fight off the gains of various historically marginalized groups now deemed socially equal with white men through civil rights legislation. This included people of color, women, LGBTQ, and newly arrived non-white immigrants, especially after 1965. From this reaction, populist conservatism was born, right? Photography captured these iconic moments when centuries-old traditions of racial discrimination confronted the language of the Constitution and all men are created equal. Under the shadow of January 6th, we see a few things, right? Crucially, we see a demographic who was forced by the federal government, or what's now called big government, to relinquish their traditionally white nationalist civic virtues in favor of a legislated multicultural America, which went against more than 300 years of white nationalist tradition. You see the language of the present in the signs of the past, especially the one on the right? The specter of communism and Christianity were mobilized in the struggle against social equality. Of course, it was only weeks ago that former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared multiculturalism is not who America is. Well, the people in these photographs would agree. So how does economics fit into this culture war? Right. So this culture war has been set up for 300 years, and then it explodes in the 1960s when the civil rights movement begins to get some gains, and you have civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the Fair Housing Rights Act of 1968. And from there, you have this massive reaction, which is the conservative culture war that pushes back against this. Where does neoliberalism fall in? So neoliberalism may be defined as an economic ideology born in the 1930s in reaction to the welfare state. So when the welfare state is created, neoliberalism is the conservative reaction to the implementation of the welfare state. Amidst the 1970s economic crisis, which many people still remember the gas lines, neoliberalism finally found implementation as policy beginning at the dawn of the 1980s. So really at the end of the 70s, the ideas of neoliberalism begin to be implemented into sort of the national economy and state economies. Removing the government's downward redistributionist mechanisms, This tidal wave of market-based principles put a safeguard around economic transactions. And this is the critical part. It kept democratic voices from interfering with the workings of the economy. Unlike what the populists did in the late 1800s and what eventually came out of that movement, which was the New Deal welfare state. Since the welfare state was essentially white nationalist in its policies, right? Some of the baggage of the welfare state, it held strong politically between the 30s and 60s, right? So conservatives and neoliberals had a tough time selling their version of economics when the welfare state was primarily directed towards white working and middle class folks. But the moment the civil rights movement comes in and the welfare state is open to historically marginalized peoples and white communities could no longer legally segregate, the recipients of the welfare state proceeded to vote conservative and vote for conservatives who aim to dismantle it. This led to votes backing the policies of neoliberalism. And this is the crucial part. I mean, you can add in the Vietnam War. Like I saw a cousin of mine just post something on Facebook. It's tied into this, right? But it's the decline in the trust of government, right? So that 60s, 70s is very much a part of this, the moment when government betrays the quote people. Vietnam War is a part of that, right? They betrayed the soldiers, but in this case, in terms of social equality legislation, it's a betrayal of Americans who inherited a 300-year legacy. To be able, liberty and freedom is the liberty and freedom to segregate and to discriminate. And so that becomes like a critical point of the culture war. Neoliberalism then sought to dismantle the welfare state through economic deregulation, privatization, the disciplining of organized labor, laws guaranteeing the global free flow of capital, and the slashing of taxes on the wealthy and corporations. We can point to a few convergences that helped pave the way to our era of neoliberalism. One was the faltering of the welfare state amidst the cost of the Vietnam War. Right, the welfare state could expand, except until the point when a foreign war starts to, create inflation. It's too expensive. But that also hits at the same moment that West Germany and Japan begin to compete with us economically. Right, up through the 50s, the U.S. sort of, didn't have to compete with too many countries economically. The growth of the growing political power of multinational conglomerates and finance. Right, this is the era of conglomeration, of capital concentration, of outsourcing. Right, beginning to, as nations overseas decolonized and became independent, they suddenly were open to foreign investment, including American multinational conglomerates who would move in and set up factories and then close factories in the U.S. And this happens, it speeds up in the 70s, but it begins to happen in that 60s moment. The other thing is the discrediting of Keynesian economists that were the architects of the welfare state. They could not fix what was happening in the 70s. And in that void came neoliberal economists with their fresh ideas. And then finally, you have the new rights conservative culture war against social equality legislation. And this was a critical element in shifting people's ideas away from the economic populism that characterized the earlier phase of the populist movement at the turn of the century, and then the economic populism of the New Deal welfare state. And that shift is towards a populist conservatism after the 1960s. The economics of neoliberalism paved the way for Reagan's supply side economics and a new assumption. Rather than demand side economics driving economic growth, neoliberalism or supply side economics theorized that giving more money to the wealthy and corporations would inevitably lead to income and wealth trickling down upon the working and middle classes. So what was the outcome of these policies since the 1970s? Right, well, one of the readings you can think about, and to me, this really defines sort of the angst of populist conservatism and populism in general, is this kind of relationship between productivity and compensation. And as you see from 1948 going to about 1973, when productivity rose, so did compensation. So in a way, you could think the harder you worked, you were rewarded for that hard work. Around 1973, and we can think about the oil crisis, and really capitalism goes into a restructuring mode in the 70s. The US isn't the only place that kind of goes into a recession. But this is the end of sort of the rise of wages. At the same time, productivity keeps going up, right? You have mechanization, but for the most part, productivity continues to rise, but compensation begins to basically stagnate. This leads to a loss in income. So late 70s going through about 10 years ago, the 1% has done pretty well since the 70s compared to everyone else. That top 20%, they've done okay compared to the bottom 80%. We can put it that way to be optimistic. At the same time, when you look at the graph on the right, the lower 80% has either stagnated at best and lost income. So people earning money now are earning less than doing the same work are earning less than they made before the 70s. And so this is sort of defines our era, right? And again, we can't think about populist conservatism without this factor, right? People are angry and they might have ideas about the guilty parties, but when you look at the data in terms of economics, you can't help but think that this doesn't stimulate sort of resentment, right? Whether it's articulated a certain way or not. People feel this in real time. So a key question in this is, how did Republicans convince white Democrats to vote for a party seeking to dismantle the very economic system that created their prosperity, right? Because during the Great Compression, people did okay, right? They did well. There was pockets of poverty here and there, but for the most part, wealth inequality was at its lowest it's ever been in the history of the United States. And we can look at Lee Atwater. I don't know if people are familiar with Lee Atwater. To me, he's such a great figure of the 80s, right? He's complete 80s. But Lee Atwater, he was the campaign manager for Reagan. And then he helped out the Bush family. And one of the great things about Lee Atwater was he was so cocky that he would kind of have these off the cuff, off the record conversations with reporters, and he would literally say what he's doing. And so there's just something, he's just kind of an interesting figure in our history. In the early 80s, he says, he literally talks about this, how do you get, poor people to vote your way, poor whites? And he says, you start out in 1954 by saying the N-word. By 1968, you can't say the N-word. That hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. Now you're getting abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic. But the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than the N-word. Right? So it's this idea of using code words instead of being explicit, but the code words are translated into, oh, we know who he's talking about. In terms of populism, again, Lee Atwater is sort of this political genius, and of course he understands how populism works, right? A couple years later, same situation, talking to reporters, don't quote me on this, and then he goes into literally talking about what he does as a career here. And he says that populists have always been liberal on economics. So long as the crucial issues were generally confined to economics, as during the New Deal, the liberal candidate would expect to get most of the populist vote. But populists are conservative on most social issues. When social and cultural issues died down, the populists were left with no compelling reason to vote Republican. When Republicans are successful in getting certain social issues to the forefront, the populist vote is ours. And just on a side here, when we think of, and I'm sure all of you have these moments where people that you know, and I just saw an article about the Oregon GOP literally just did an official announcement, like not a fringe group, the Oregon GOP, and they basically asserted that January 6th was a false flag and did not actually happen, and that it was just to discredit Trump. We can kind of think about this within this paragraph. Economic issues are making people hurt, and the social issues are getting so thin that we're now, or the GOP is now resorting to sort of a level of fantasy that is stunning, right? Sort of the fake news, the QAnon, but that GOP thing today about the Oregon GOP, it kind of really fits into this. But this is the culture war, right? The culture war conjoined with the conservative push towards neoliberalism. However, as Atwater points out, conservatives would adopt colorblind code words to highlight race without mentioning race. These new code words regenerated anti-Black sentiment, including welfare queens and today's Black on Black crime. Right. On talk radio, the culture war took aim at Hollywood elites, gay marriage, feminists, immigrants, and other institutions deemed an enemy of tradition, including academics. Right. Meanwhile, the standard of living for white Americans who enjoyed the welfare state's redistribution of wealth declined at the same time. There were visible gains for people of color and women in the public sphere after 1960 social equality legislation. One could see change in media projections while also seeing a decline in the view that American leadership should be white and male, as it had been traditionally for 300 years. The safety valve for those feeling left behind by the neoliberal economy, of course, took shape as populist conservatism. As Jan Werner Mueller suggests, populism is, quote, a particular moralistic imagination of politics, a way of perceiving the political world that sets a morally pure and fully unified people against elites who are deemed corrupt or in some other way morally inferior, end quote. The populist movement of the late 1800s defined their struggle against capital concentration and the rise of corporations as a moral threat to their liberty during the late 19th century. In this sense, the economic populism provided the moral foundations for the New Deal welfare state. Populist conservatism, on the other hand, discards the economic critique of concentrated wealth and embraces the more broad-based cultural conservatism linked to traditional ideas about hierarchies and the racial, gendered, sexual, or religious status quo, right? Or we could go back to Kirk's divine tactic, right? The station that you were born into. Mob violence is a populist conservative reaction, and it historically arises during periods when freedom and liberty is extended to those formerly excluded from participating in civil society. We saw this in the 1898 Wilmington Massacre and the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. Right? Just as settler colonialism and slavery, right, that first slide, created a zero-sum relationship between people of European descent and enslaved people and Native Americans, the extension of freedom and liberty to people previously deemed inferior is often viewed as a threat to white freedom and liberty. Just look at the violent language attacking gay marriage, transgender rights, or the idea of, if you've seen these quotes, multiculturalism equals white genocide, right? It's framed as a zero-sum situation. The fervor is a combination of cultural resentment, of course, fueled within a larger context of economic insecurity, an insecurity which appears to connect the lost fortunes of the white working and middle class from that Great Compression, the welfare state era, to the rising tide of multicultural America. For many, multiculturalism and the turn away from traditional values is the reason for the decline in standards of living, right? It's a turn away from Russell Kirk's idea of divine tactic, right? As Pompeo makes clear, multiculturalism needs to be attacked in the name of liberty and freedom. On January 6, 2021, the descendants of the 1960s conservative culture war assaulted the symbol of government, which it went from distrust in government to now we're in the overthrowing of government through a push or a coup. The ghosts of the past were surely by their sides as they asserted their freedom and liberty. Right? So now we're at a crossroads. Right? A poll taken a day after the assault on the Capitol saw 45% of Republicans supporting the action. With this in mind, we need to ask, where do we go from here? It is obvious the signs and flags we see in some of these pictures. There is still lingering resentment towards the rise of multiculturalism. We are confronted with a tidal wave of legacies that are out of our hands. And this is, I usually say this in class and there's always kind of a shock, but, the 1970s, we can't forget this shift from the 60s and 70s. The 1970s was the first decade in the history of the United States when white men, especially white men with property, were legislatively forced into social equality with women and people of color for the very first time. We were a slave country for 246 years and a Jim Crow nation for 87 years after emancipation. This adds up to over 300 years of an explicitly white nationalist society. And this is the sobering moment. We are only 50 years into the era of legislated social equality, barely 2 generations into this. So we really can't change the culture war flow of information and knowledge embedded across 2 generations at least. But we can change the way we approach talking about economic realities of the present and concrete policies towards addressing these concerns. In short, we need to speak past the noise of conspiracy and resentment and offer policies that people can see and feel, right? And these policies need to be aimed towards the lower 95%, not the 1%, not even the 5%. They have done well since the 1980s, as you saw on that graph. The 95%, and especially that lower 80%, have not, and they're angry, right? In many ways, Democrats have fueled this anger by uncritically embracing the policies of neoliberalism without taking stock of how these policies have played out across the last 40 years. And we can put Biden in this, Obama, and Clinton. They're all guilty of uncritically embracing neoliberalism. Since the 1970s, the Democratic Party has lost contact with workers and middle class people, including small farmers and business owners, all of whom have not been on the beneficial side of neoliberal globalization. One tactic would be to talk to small business owners, the primary source of employment in communities. What do they need? What difficulties do they face? Unlike multinational conglomerates, small business is more thoroughly anchored to their communities. They are not going to outsource anytime soon. They will not take bailout money while transferring jobs overseas or paying off CEOs and shareholders. They will take the money and plug it back into the local economy. With that, there will be more circulation, more purchases, and more economic growth, and it stays local. And you have to make these policies transparent. You have to make them visible. Seeing is believing. This is the only way forward in a world of mob violence and conspiracy. And thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing. I would personally recommend the D.H. Lawrence book. After I read the quote, I sat down and read it. It's timely and it's wonderful. And can you also tell us how to get your new book that's coming out and when it's going to be released?
I'm currently waiting for the first round of, I guess, copy edits.
Okay.
The manuscript is in, and then now I'm sure it'll arrive probably around midterms,
Okay.
when I'm fully
Well,
sick.
okay. Keep us posted and we
But
will
it should
push
be
it out.
by summer. It should be out by summer.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to that. And to everyone that joined us, is there any questions or anything anyone would like to discuss or comments?
We didn't have any questions that came in through chat. Oh, we just got a new chat. But I was going to say, I think we're a small enough group, really. If you just want to unmute and ask a question, that would be perfectly fine.
I would. So you made a really good start towards helping me understand people we know, people we go to church with, people we work with who are educated, doing well. They're not poor. They have businesses, they have professions, and yet they still are gung-ho conservatives. You made me begin to understand that, but can you say more? You keep thinking, there's always going to be tyrants and idiots. There's always going to be Trumps and Hitlers. But what's scary is 74 million people voted for him. That's what just baffles me.
Well, I think, it connects with, there's a question, Tim Peterson, how would you explain the political differences between rural and urban areas? And this goes towards your question. Urban areas are more efficient hubs for the circulation of capital in a neoliberal world, right? And we have to think about this in the sense of, the internet is changing things. Like one of my sort of I feel like Hayes is well positioned, I think, to work through the 21st century precisely because it's isolated, but it can use its isolation as a benefit, because in the internet world, anyone can be anywhere. And I think COVID has shown that you don't really need to be in an office to be productive. But in terms of this kind of the difference between rural and urban, urban areas are by default more multicultural. So suburbs and rural areas, for the most part, are historically white. And there's a reason. There's Bruce Campney has done a lot of good scholarship on, he wrote a book on Kansas, but I'm assigning one called Hostile Heartland, and it talks about sundown towns and that sort of thing. And when African Americans left the South, they were terrorized everywhere they went. And so there's a reason why suburbs are white and rural communities are predominantly white. This is the legacy that we really don't have control over. I grew up in small, like I always say small, but I mean like 80,000. After I moved to Hayes, I'm like, I can't say small anymore. 80,000 is not. But I grew up in communities that were basically connected to a rural culture, like the Central Valley of California, you could call it the Central Valley of Washington. I grew up in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. I lived in Idaho Falls, Idaho. And there's a disconnect between everyday experience, but then what you see in media. And I always think of, like when people say liberal media, the liberal media is projecting the multicultural America that unfolded after the 60s, but it doesn't have, but the liberal media or the mainstream media, or I would say corporate media, because they're owned by corporations, they aren't nonprofit. They're projecting a certain idea about the world. And for the most part, it's hard to find shows. What was the Roseanne Barr? Despite Roseanne Barr today, but back in the 80s, that was a radical show to watch during Reagan. Like, whoa, like every episode, you're like, oh, they're gonna eat, right? Like the level of poverty amidst sort of that Reagan utopia. But at the same time, these rural areas, as you see in closed storefronts, capital dried up, right? Capital moved elsewhere. Walmart moved in. Walmart takes our money and then shifts it somewhere else. Local business takes our money and they go deposit in the bank or they go buy something on Main Street. I think people forgot how sort of economics works, and we're just like, oh, there's cheap stuff at Walmart. At the same time, when you turn on the TV, you're going to see multicultural America, and it seems like multicultural America is doing better than white rural America, or urban America is doing better than white rural America. And I think that's a big part of this, because I really don't like, people aren't dumb. Like, there's so many people I know that voted for Trump, they're conservative and they're smart. I know they're smarter than me. So you can't just say that people are dumb. For me, going through the PhD, and writing what I've written, I've been thinking about this for like 10 years now in terms of this book. I chalk it up to language and knowledge flows. Like, we all have a set of language and knowledge that we gravitate towards. And if that language and knowledge doesn't describe the world we perceive around us, we're going to find something else that does. I would argue that today's sort of, like the Oregon GOP, we're now going into conspiracy theories are now mainstream. That should tell us that we shouldn't condemn that as people being dumb and gullible. We should use that, we should see that as a symptom of the language and knowledge, people that embrace that language and knowledge that they previously used does not describe the world that they see. This conspiracy theory stuff does, right? QAnon for many people describes the world that they see. Of course, this is the reason. And that's the part where you're not going to be able to control that. But we know that, buried in this DNA of populism is the economic populism. And I think that the best tactic to deal with this is creating policies that cut through that noise and have it transparent and make something happen that isn't based off giving more, subsidies and bailouts to multinationals that they could care less about communities like Hayes or Ellis County. Like, they're here to make a buck. Walmart will close as soon as it's in their best interest. Today's code words. I mean, there's so many code words. Thug, right? Thug is an update of what 100 years ago you would call the Black Brute, right? Birth of a Nation, that film from 1915 personified the brute, right? The Black man that is wants to rape all the white women. That evolved over time, right? Black Power kind of was targeted with that in the 60s. And then the thug is sort of an updated version of it. You could say, remember in the 80s, for those remember the wilding, right? The Central Park Five, and sort of the wilding of youths of color. That was an updating of code words. Welfare Queen's the most popular. Reagan helped create that one. Black on black crime is really interesting. Whenever I talk in Orange County, I mean, the big difference between here in Orange County is in Orange County, there's everyone in terms of it's completely multicultural, but politically, you have no idea if someone's Republican or Democrat. And so there's no majority. I think most of the area is votes liberal, but there are a lot of Republicans. And so you engage with people about, everyday things. And when Black Lives Matter came out and, what do you think of Black Lives Matter? And I give my answer, and then someone would always, it's sort of, and this is where it's systematic, right? The language and knowledge. It's not that they're dumb, but it's the language and knowledge that they have to use to explain the world. And, they'd always come back with, well, what about black on black crime? And to me, that's really an update of what I know all of us in here heard growing up, right? That's being a scholar of conservatism and race and African American history, I grew up in all these environments. I grew up with, hearing explicit racism my whole life. It was just a norm, right? And what we all heard growing up about slavery, like, so if, for many white Americans, they don't want to hear about slavery. That's why the Trump 1776 Commission, which is in reaction to the 1619 that, tries to get at the root of slavery. Well, the black on black crime version of when we talk about slavery is, oh, well, they were enslaving each other, right? It's, just because the founders had slaves and the United States had slavery, that doesn't matter, because the people in Africa were enslaving each other. And what that, in our heads, what that creates is there was no differentiation of hierarchy. There was no centralized cities that would prey on rural areas, which was sort of, that's in Africa, that was the case. But instead it assumes that it's just a state of absolute savagery, where you would go around and just kidnap anyone and then go trade them to Europeans. And that's what black on black crime suggests. It's an update of that old phrase. And the reason why a lot of people use it is it has that familiarity, right? It's updated with the new political context. And so it's the same language and knowledge, but it's expressed with a new phrase, right? That you can, oh, I'm not being racist, but one of the ways that, that I like to ask, if someone asks me about black on black crime, I'm always like, well, what about white on white crime? That seems epidemic, right? Go through the list of school shooters. What is it with young white men in this era of multiculturalism and wealth inequality and sort of a dire future? Climate change, you imagine growing, a lot of people grew up with, that 50s where you're ducking under the desk. I'm sure that created a legacy of paranoia. But now it's, oh, by the time we're, retiring, this planet's going to be on fire, and what's going to happen, climate change. Yeah, I lost my train of thought. I'm getting my cold, so. But the code words, I think that, it's that language and knowledge, right? It's the way that they're describing their reality, and they're, you're reaching for certain things, but.
We have gone past our time. Trina, this has really been fun for me. I hope the rest of you have enjoyed this. I've learned so much.
It's very interesting. I wish the more people would be enlightened with this topic that we have tonight. It was really wonderful. I thank everyone for joining. Keep looking on Facebook, email me, follow us on Twitter. Let's get this party up and started again. I'm really excited. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thank
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
You never gone to the